The silo was not empty when Dora Pitch climbed into it. There was still grain at the bottom, maybe 8 inches of old wheat, dry and compacted, left from the previous harvest by a man named Ennis Flood, who had filed on the quarter section adjacent to the Pitch family claim and had abandoned it in the spring of 1885 without explanation, leaving behind a timber-framed grain silo, a collapsed well casing, and a fence line that had since been absorbed by the grass. Dora had found the silo in June while walking the property boundary after her father told her she had until the end of August to find another arrangement. She had stood at its base and looked up at the circular wall of vertical set planking, 12 feet in diameter, 18 feet high, and she had thought about it for 3 days before she came back with tools. Her father had not been cruel about it. That was the part she kept returning to in those 3 days of thinking. Calvin Pitch was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, and the practice he was applying was the arithmetic of a Dakota Territory homestead in 1886, a claim that could not support the labor it required, a family of 7, a daughter of 18 who had been promised to a man named Garrett Wells the previous November, and who had unpromised herself in April when Garrett Wells revealed a temperament that Dora considered disqualifying. Calvin had not argued with her assessment of Garrett Wells. He had simply presented the arithmetic. The claim could not carry an unattached woman of working age who was not contributing to its marital or economic future. She had until August. She had been a carpenter's apprentice to her father since she was 9 years old, not officially. Dakota Territory in 1886 did not have official female carpenter apprentices in any category a court would recognize. But Calvin Pitch had needed help, and Dora had been present and willing. And 9 years of handing tools, holding boards, reading levels, and watching her father solve structural problems had produced a woman who could frame a wall, set a door, cut a mortise joint, and read the load distribution of a structure by looking at it the way a doctor reads a patient's color, quickly, accurately, and with specific conclusions about what needed to be done. She came back to the silo on the 1st of July with the following: a claw hammer, a crosscut saw, a draw knife, a spirit level, a coil of rope, a bag of cut nails, 3 wool blankets, and a determination that she had finished apologizing for being the person she was. The silo's structural condition was better than it looked. The vertical planking had weathered to a silver gray, and 2 boards on the northwest face had split along their grain from freeze-thaw cycling, letting in 2 fingers of light at shoulder height. The timber base ring was solid, 3-inch oak, still tight at the lap joints, carrying the wall load without visible deflection. The roof was a conical timber frame covered in board and batten sheathing that had lost 4 battens on the south face, leaving gaps that admitted rain, but had not yet compromised the primary boards beneath. The floor was the old wheat over compacted earth. Dora spent the first week on assessment and repair. She replaced the split planks with boards she pulled from the abandoned fence line, ripping them to width with the crosscut saw and face-nailing them over the gaps with the claw hammer until the northwest face was weather-tight. She cut new battens from the same fence boards and nailed them over the roof gaps, working from a rope harness she rigged from the roof peak that let her lean out over the cone at the angle she needed without using both hands for balance. She swept the old wheat to the wall perimeter and used it as the base layer of what would become the floor insulation, packing it tight against the base ring and covering it with a layer of cut prairie grass she hauled in from the field in armloads. The interior space after clearing was 11 feet of usable diameter. She stood in the center and turned slowly, reading the structure above her, the way her father had taught her to read any enclosed space, looking for where the load traveled, where the weakness lived, where the opportunity was. The silo had one problem and one significant advantage. The problem was ventilation. A sealed grain silo was designed to minimize air exchange to protect its contents, and a human being living in a sealed grain silo in a Dakota summer would cook before September. The advantage was thermal mass. The vertical plank walls, 12 inches thick at the base ring and backed by packed earth berm on the north and west faces where Ennis flood had graded the site, held temperature the way a root cellar held temperature, resistant to change, slow to heat in summer, and slow to cool in winter. The earth contact doing the work that insulation did in standard construction. She solved the ventilation problem in the second week. 2 vent openings, cut with the crosscut saw at opposite points of the circular wall 6 feet above the floor, northeast and southwest. Aligned with the prevailing summer wind direction she had been observing since childhood, without ever being asked to observe it formally. Each opening 8 inches wide and 4 inches tall, covered with a sliding board shutter, she fitted into grooves cut in the framing with the draw knife. Open in summer for cross-draft, closed in winter to seal the thermal envelope. A solution so direct, it required no explanation to anyone who had ever thought carefully about how air moved through an enclosed space. She moved in on the 14th of July. She had not told her father what she was building. She had not told anyone. She carried her 3 wool blankets and her small tin of personal items, and the bone-handled knife she had carried since she was 12, and she walked across the field boundary in the August heat, and she did not look back at the Pitch family claim. She was 18 years old. She had a hammer and a level and 9 years of watching carefully, and she intended to be warm when the Dakota winter arrived. The town found out about her in September, not because Dora told anyone, because Mabel Greer, who ran the dry goods counter at the Bone Steel Trading Post and had the observational habits of a woman who considered other people's business a form of community resource, noticed that Dora Pitch had been coming in every 10 days or so for small quantities of specific supplies: cut nails, window glazing compound, a paper of brass screws, a small tin of linseed oil, and was paying for them with coins she had earned taking in mending from 3 farm families on the north side of the township. Mabel had done the arithmetic of those purchases the way she did the arithmetic of most things she observed, and the arithmetic said construction, and the only structure on the flood claimed that was worth constructing anything inside was the silo. Mabel mentioned it to her husband over supper. Her husband mentioned it to the grain merchant Toll Purdy, who rode out to the flood claim boundary on a Thursday afternoon in September and sat on his horse at the fence line and looked at the silo for a long time. The northwest face was tight. The roof battens were new. Thin smoke was rising from a small exterior fire pit Dora had built against the east face for cooking, a shallow stone ring set far enough from the structure to eliminate fire risk, vented by the same prevailing northeast wind she had used to design the interior ventilation. Toll Purdy rode back to Bone Steel and told 3 people what he had seen, and by Sunday it was general knowledge. The town's reaction divided along predictable lines. The older women thought it was dangerous and said so at volume in the places where older women said things at volume in Bone Steel in 1886, which was primarily the trading post and the church steps after Sunday service. A girl of 18 alone in a grain silo on an abandoned claim was an invitation to disaster in any of the several forms that disaster took on the Dakota frontier: fire, weather, men of the category that abandoned claims produced. Two of them rode out to speak to Calvin Pitch about his responsibility in the matter, and Calvin had listened to them with the patient expression of a man who had already had this conversation with himself and had reached conclusions he was not going to share with them. The younger men thought it was interesting and rode by the silo periodically in groups of 2 and 3 to observe it from the fence line, the way young men observe things they do not fully understand but find compelling. Dora noted their visits from the vent opening and did not acknowledge them. She had a bone-handled knife and a .32 caliber revolver she had traded 2 months of mending work to acquire from a departing homesteader, and she had her father's ability to assess a structural situation quickly and respond to what it actually required rather than what it appeared to require. The young men eventually stopped coming by. Through September, she improved the silo's interior with the systematic attention she had brought to every phase of the project. She built a sleeping platform 18 inches above the floor on a timber frame she constructed from fence post sections, raising herself above the cold zone that pooled at ground level in the hours before dawn. The platform surface she covered with a double layer of cut prairie grass compressed under a wool blanket, producing a sleeping surface that was firm and insulating and required no materials she had not sourced within a quarter mile of the silo. She built a small shelf unit from fence board scraps against the east wall, 3 shelves at standing height, for her supplies and tools, and the small notebook she had begun keeping in August. Dimensions, temperatures, materials, modifications. The same data discipline her father had used in his carpentry work, applied now to the project of her own survival. She solved the cooking problem in October. The exterior fire pit was adequate for summer, but she understood it would not serve her through a Dakota winter. Cooking outside at -20 degrees was not a workable proposition, and bringing an open fire inside a timber-framed grain silo was a proposition she had no interest in testing. The solution she arrived at was a clay and stone thermal mass cooker built against the silo's interior north wall. Not a stove in any conventional sense, but a dense masonry block with a firebox cavity at its base and a flat cooking surface at working height, vented through a 3-inch clay pipe. She ran through the wall, planking at a height above the firebox that created natural draft without requiring a vertical flue. The pipe exited the exterior wall at an angle that shed rain and snow while maintaining draw, capped with a flat stone set on 3 small wedges that allowed exhaust to escape while blocking direct wind entry. The thermal mass absorbed heat during cooking and released it slowly for hours afterward. She had observed this principle in the clay bread ovens her mother built outdoors in summer. Structures that were warm to the touch hours after the fire inside them had gone cold, and she had scaled and adapted it to the silo's spatial constraints and material availability with the practical confidence of a woman who had been watching her father solve exactly this category of problem for 9 years. The first real cold arrived in the 3rd week of October, not the season's worst. That was still building somewhere above the Canadian line, but a front that dropped the bone steel temperature to 18 degrees overnight and stayed there for 4 days, while the township's homesteaders burned through their early season wood supplies and assessed their winter readiness with the particular anxiety of people who have been through a Dakota winter before and understand what is coming. Dora banked her thermal mass cooker before bed, closed both vent shutters to their winter position, and pulled her wool blankets over the sleeping platform. She woke to a silo interior temperature she estimated at 34 degrees. Outside, it was 18 degrees. Inside her 12-foot diameter timber cylinder, with its earth-bermed north and west walls, and its sealed thermal envelope, and its slowly cooling masonry block. She was 16 degrees warmer than the open air. She noted it in the notebook and then built a small fire in the cooker firebox and ate boiled cornmeal and thought about January. The town of Bonesteel had its first serious crisis on the 1st of November. A grass fire started by a lightning strike on the South Flat moved north on a 30-mile-per-hour wind and reached the township's southern edge before the volunteer bucket line could establish a meaningful break. It took 3 structures: the livery stable, the feed warehouse, and the 2-room frame building that served as both schoolhouse and community meeting hall. Nobody died. The livery horses were moved in time. But the feed warehouse loss was significant, representing a quarter of the township's stored winter grain. And the loss of the meeting hall left the township without its only enclosed communal space at the beginning of the season that required communal spaces most. Toll. Purdy stood in the ash of the meeting hall on the morning of November 2nd and looked at what the fire had taken, and then looked north toward the flood claim boundary where the silo roof cone was just visible above the grass line. He rode out that afternoon and knocked on the silo wall because there was no door to knock on, and Dora opened the vent shutter and looked out at him. He asked if she would consider allowing the township to use the silo for community meetings through the winter while the meeting hall was rebuilt. He said he understood it was her home and that the request was irregular and that he was asking rather than assuming. He said the township would compensate her for the inconvenience in whatever form she considered fair. Dora looked at him through the vent opening for a moment. She asked him how many people attended a typical township meeting. He said 12 to 15, sometimes 20 in a serious situation. She told him she would need 3 days to make modifications. The 3 modifications took 4 days, not 3. Dora had underestimated the door framing by a day. Cutting a proper opening in the vertical plank wall required removing 2 full-length boards without compromising the circular wall's structural integrity, which meant installing a relieving header above the opening before removing the boards below it, which meant sourcing header timber of sufficient dimension from the Bonesteel trading post on credit she negotiated with Mabel Greer in exchange for 3 months of mending work at a rate they agreed on in writing with Mabel's husband as witness. The door itself she hung on hand-forged strap hinges she bought from the blacksmith Cass Minden for 40 cents. Setting them into a door frame, she cut and fitted with the draw knife to tolerances tight enough that the door swung without binding and seated against its stop. Without a gap she could pass a knife blade through. She fitted a wooden latch on the interior and a hasp and staple on the exterior for a padlock she did not yet own. She built a small timber entry vestibule outside the door opening, 3 walls and a roof, 4 feet deep, open at the outer end, that would break the direct wind entry every time the door opened during a winter meeting and would shed the snow that accumulated at the threshold. She expanded the thermal mass cooker firebox to double its original capacity, adding courses of flat stone to the exterior mass that increased the heat storage volume by roughly 60%. The expanded mass would require 2 hours of sustained burning to charge fully, but would hold its heat for 6 hours after the fire went out, long enough to carry a 2-hour community meeting through to its end and leave residual warmth in the silo for the hours after. She installed 4 additional vent openings at ceiling height, each fitted with sliding shutters, positioned to allow controlled ventilation when 20 people were generating body heat and respiration in a sealed 12-foot cylinder. Inadequate ventilation in an enclosed space with that occupancy load would produce carbon dioxide accumulation within 40 minutes. She had read about this in a mining safety pamphlet she had found in her father's tool chest when she was 14, left there by a traveling government surveyor, and she had stored the information the way she stored everything useful, without knowing specifically when she would need it, but certain that she would. Toll Purdy came back on the 4th day and looked at the door and the vestibule and walked inside and stood in the center of the silo and turned slowly the way Dora had turned when she first assessed the space in July. He looked at the sleeping platform against the west wall, the shelf unit with its notebook and supplies, the expanded thermal mass cooker against the north wall with its clay pipe vent running through the planking. He looked at the 4 new ceiling vents with their sliding shutters. He looked at the 11-foot diameter of usable floor space and did a quiet head count calculation that arrived at the same number Dora had already calculated. 15 people, standing with working room, 20 if they were willing to stand close. He said it would do. Dora said she knew it would do. She said she had measured it. The first township meeting in the silo was held on the 8th of November, 11 people standing in a circle on the packed earth and prairie grass floor, while the thermal mass cooker radiated heat from the north wall, and the single tallow lantern Dora had contributed to the communal lighting hung from a roof rafter on a wire hook. The agenda was the feed warehouse loss and the winter grain shortage it created, and the question of which families were most exposed and what the township could collectively do about it. The meeting ran 90 minutes. When it ended, the silo was warm enough that 3 of the attending men had removed their coats, which was a thing none of them had expected to be doing in a grain silo in Dakota Territory in November. Arnie Strickland, who ran the township's largest grain operation and had said nothing during Dora's initial weeks in the silo beyond a single comment to Toll Purdy about the inadvisability of encouraging irregular arrangements, stood at the door on his way out and looked at the vestibule construction and the door framing and the header she had installed above the opening. He was a man who had built 3 structures in the township, including the feed warehouse that had just burned, and he looked at Dora's door, framing the way a man looks at work that is better than he expected and is deciding whether to say so. He said the header was sized correctly for the span. Dora said she knew. He asked who had taught her to frame a door opening. She said her father had taught her by having her watch, and then having her do it, and then telling her what she had done wrong until she stopped doing it wrong. Strickland looked at the header one more time and went out through the vestibule without further comment, which was the closest thing to a formal endorsement that Arnie Strickland's temperament allowed. The township used the silo for 7 meetings between November and March. The grain shortage meeting, 2 meetings about the meeting hall reconstruction, at which Dora sat against the wall on her sleeping platform and answered structural questions when Strickland directed the matter, which he began doing at the second meeting and continued doing at every subsequent one. A meeting about a boundary dispute on the North Flat. 2 meetings about spring planting coordination. 1 meeting in February about a family on the south side of the township whose father had gone through the ice on the creek and whose wife and 4 children needed support through the remainder of the winter. At that last meeting, Dora contributed 4 weeks of mending work to the family's support ledger without being asked. She wrote it in the notebook that evening, not as charity, but as a transaction. 4 weeks of labor, specified recipient, expected completion date. Her father's influence again. A debt recorded was a debt that existed. A debt unrecorded was a favor that could be forgotten. The meeting hall reconstruction began in April, when the ground thawed enough to dig a foundation. Strickland ran the build. On the second day of framing, he rode out to the silo and asked Dora if she wanted work. He said he needed someone who could cut a mortise joint to tolerance and read a level without being told which end was which. He said he paid the same rate regardless of who was swinging the hammer. He said this last part in the flat tone of a man stating a policy rather than making a concession, which meant it was true and not subject to renegotiation. Dora said she would start Monday. She locked the silo with the padlock she had finally bought in December and walked to the bone steel construction site on a Monday morning in April with her claw hammer on her belt and her spirit level under her arm, and her father's 9 years of instruction in her hands, and she went to work. The silo stood on the flood claim for another 11 years. Dora used it as a workshop after the meeting hall was rebuilt, keeping her tools there and taking on carpentry work from township families who had watched her frame a door in a grain silo and decided that was sufficient qualification. She never moved back to the Pitch family claim. She never married Garrett Wells or anyone like him. She built 4 structures in bone steel before the century turned. Every one of them was still standing when she was 40.